What happens when a brilliant young mind stands up for true education? In today's story, Barron Trump walks into a calculus class expecting math, but ends up facing a professor with an agenda. What happens next? A jaw-dropping moment of genius that no one saw coming. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll see why true knowledge always wins. Let me know in the comments, do you believe education should focus on facts over politics? At Cambridge Institute of Technology in Boston, Professor Eleanor Hayes had built a reputation as one of the sharpest mathematical minds on campus. Her advanced calculus course attracted some of the most brilliant students, eager to master the complexities of higher mathematics. But in recent years, something had changed. Her lectures had started veering away from calculus, drifting into ideological discussions that left some students inspired and others frustrated. That morning, as students filed into the massive lecture hall, an unusual tension filled the air. They were expecting to see a board filled with intricate equations, the kind that made even the best students sweat. But instead, bold letters stretched across the whiteboard. Redefining academic priorities. A murmur swept through the room. Some students exchanged curious glances. Others sighed, already bracing for what was coming. Was today going to be about calculus or something else entirely? At the very back of the lecture hall, Barron Trump sat with his usual quiet confidence. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, he looked more like a visiting diplomat than a college student. While he rarely sought the spotlight, his perfect test scores and reputation for mathematical brilliance were well known. Everyone knew who he was, the son of a president, a young man whose intellect was rumored to be just as impressive as his last name. Yet what most of his classmates didn't realize was that behind his reserved demeanor lay a mind sharper than anyone in that room could imagine. As the lecture hall settled into uneasy silence, Professor Eleanor Hayes strode to the front, her heels clicking against the tile floor. She glanced over the students with an air of authority, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. This wasn't going to be a typical calculus class. Mathematics is important, she began, pacing deliberately. But education isn't just about solving equations. It must also address real-world inequalities. A few students nodded, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Instead of complex integrals or differential equations, the professor clicked to the first slide of her presentation, a chart on gender disparities in STEM fields. Barron's eyebrows raised slightly, but his face remained unreadable. Slide after slide flashed across the screen, each one emphasizing social issues over mathematics. Some students glanced around, uncertain. This was supposed to be an advanced calculus lecture. Instead, it was beginning to feel like a sociology seminar. Then, a single hand rose. Slow, steady, deliberate. It was Barron. Professor Hayes paused for a fraction of a second. Her eyes flickered with something... surprise or maybe amusement. Then, a smirk curled at the edges of her lips. "Yes, Mr. Trump?" she asked, folding her arms. Her tone was laced with amusement, as if she was already anticipating an easy rebuttal. Barron met her gaze with the same calm composure that had made him an enigma to his classmates. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, polite, but firm. "Many of us enrolled in this course to deepen our mathematical knowledge," he said. "Wouldn't reducing the core curriculum disadvantage all students, regardless of background?" A ripple of tension passed through the room. Some students exchanged glances, others straightened in their seats, suddenly more interested in where this was going. Professor Hayes let out a short, knowing laugh. "Oh, Mr. Trump," she said, shaking her head. "That depends entirely on how you define disadvantage. Barron said nothing, he just waited. The battle of wits had begun. The room fell into an uneasy silence. A few students nodded in agreement with Barron's point, while others shifted in their seats. But Professor Hayes wasn't backing down. She saw her chance. An opportunity to remind him that no amount of privilege could outmatch her authority in this classroom. She folded her arms and leaned slightly against her desk, her smirk returning. "Perhaps, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice smooth but pointed, "you should take a moment to reflect on how privilege shapes educational opportunities. Not everyone in this room had private tutors and elite prep schools to guide them." A few students chuckled under their breath, sensing what she was trying to do. It was a baited trap, one meant to frame Barron as out of touch, as someone whose success was built on wealth rather than merit. But Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled gently, his expression completely unfazed. "You're right about one thing, Professor," he said calmly. "I have had advantages. And that's exactly why I believe in maintaining high academic standards, so everyone, regardless of background, has the opportunity to reach their full potential." A murmur rippled through the room. Some students sat up a little straighter, intrigued by how effortlessly Barron had flipped the argument on its head. Instead of becoming defensive, he had owned his privilege and used it to advocate for academic excellence. For the first time, Professor Hayes hesitated. Her smirk twitched just slightly before she masked it with an air of confidence. She needed to regain control, and so, with a dramatic pivot, she turned to the whiteboard. "Let's test that belief, shall we?" she announced. She picked up a marker and began writing, a sprawling, brutally complex, multivariable calculus problem, the kind that made even the best students' stomachs drop. By the time she finished, the board was nearly filled with dense notation. A hushed whisper spread across the lecture hall. "That's graduate-level stuff," one student muttered under his breath. Another nudged his friend. "She's trying to humiliate him." Professor Hayes stepped back, admiring her work. Then, with a satisfied smile, she turned to Barron. "Since you're so passionate about mathematics, Mr. Trump," she said, tilting her head, "why don't you show us how it's done?" For a brief moment, all eyes shifted to Barron, but if the professor was expecting hesitation, she was about to be sorely disappointed. Barron didn't look intimidated, he looked intrigued. He stood up from his seat, adjusting his suit jacket with an effortless grace. Then, as he walked toward the front of the room, he studied the equation, not with fear, but with the quiet curiosity of someone who had seen this level of mathematics before. Then, in a smooth, measured voice, he asked, "Would you prefer the standard solution or a more elegant approach based on Leibniz's original work?" The room went still. Professor Hayes blinked. A flicker of something crossed her face. Confusion? Maybe even doubt? "You've read Leibniz's original papers?" she asked, unable to keep the skepticism from her tone. Barron simply nodded. "Yes," he said, matter-of-factly. "In German. The translations don't quite capture the full elegance of his methodology." The class was frozen in stunned silence. No one had expected this, not even the professor. Barron Trump, standing at the front of the room, held the marker with steady confidence. His movements were smooth, deliberate, precise. He didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess. He simply knew. As his hand glided across the whiteboard, complex symbols and equations emerged. Not in a frantic scroll, but in a perfectly structured, methodical flow. Each step was clear, each concept neatly broken down. And then something unexpected happened. Students started leaning in. The problem, which had seemed impossible just moments ago, was suddenly making sense. Even those who normally struggled with calculus found themselves nodding along, following his logic with surprising ease. Phones came out. Students began recording, capturing every stroke of the marker, every calm explanation. Some whispered to each other in disbelief. Others just watched, captivated. Barron wasn't just solving the problem, he was teaching it. His voice was smooth, steady. This first step, he explained, uses a technique developed by Euler in 1755. It simplifies what seems complex into something far more approachable. Professor Hayes, who had been standing with her arms crossed, suddenly shifted. Her confident smirk had disappeared. Her arms slowly lowered, her fingers twitching slightly. She was no longer the one in control of the classroom. Barron reached the final step, adding the last clean stroke to his solution. Then he turned, meeting the professor's gaze with a quiet, unshakable confidence. "We could take the traditional approach," he said, gesturing to the problem, "but Leibniz's method gets us there more efficiently. Which would you prefer?" Every student turned to Professor Hayes, waiting. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Her eyes flicked to the board, then back to Barron. She had no answer. And then, the door swung open. Dean Callahan strode in, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "Eleanor," he said, his voice firm, "we need you for an emergency faculty meeting about curriculum updates." The timing couldn't have been better. For her, she turned back to the class, clearing her throat. "We'll continue this another time," she announced, already stepping away. But before she could reach the door, Barron spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the entire room. "Professor, you challenged me in front of the entire class," he said evenly. "Walking away now would teach the wrong lesson about academic integrity." The room erupted in murmurs. Professor Hayes froze. Dean Callahan's face darkened slightly. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting," Barron interrupted politely. "I'm stating a fact. This was no longer just about calculus. It was about principles, integrity, merit." Professor Hayes's fingers curled slightly at her sides. She had set the rules for this battle. But Barron Trump had just changed the game. But Barron wasn't finished. His voice, steady and unwavering, cut through the murmurs filling the lecture hall. "Professor, you challenged me in front of everyone," he said, locking eyes with her. "Walking away now would teach the wrong lesson about academic integrity." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Dean Callahan tensed. His posture stiffened as he glanced at the students, most of whom were now watching intently, their phones still recording. "Are you suggesting—" the dean started, his voice edged with warning. "I'm not suggesting," Barron interrupted, his tone polite but firm. "I'm stating a fact." The tension in the room crackled like a charged wire. Students whispered, their curiosity turning into outright fascination. Then Barron did something that no one expected. With an easy, almost effortless motion, he turned back toward Professor Hayes and held out the marker. "Perhaps you'd prefer to show us your solution first?" he asked, his voice calm, almost inviting. "After all, as you said, status shouldn't matter. Only knowledge should." A wave of silence washed over the class. Professor Hayes froze. She stared at the problem on the board. The very problem she had designed to humiliate Barron Trump. But now it stood as something else entirely. A test. And this time she was the one being challenged. Barron's offer wasn't hostile, there was no arrogance in his voice. If anything, there was something even more dangerous in his demeanor. Certainty. The professor's jaw tightened. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, waiting, anticipating. And then Barron spoke again, offering her a way out. "Or," he said, his voice measured, "we could solve it together. Collaboration often leads to deeper understanding." A few students exhaled sharply. The sheer brilliance of the move was unmistakable. He wasn't just challenging her mathematically anymore, he was giving her a choice: humble herself or refuse in front of a crowd that would remember this moment forever. For a fleeting second, there was a shift in her eyes. Uncertainty, hesitation. But it was gone just as quickly as it appeared, because in the end, her pride wouldn't allow it. She snapped. "This is absurd," she barked, her voice sharp, almost shrill. She threw the marker down onto the desk with a loud clack. "This is just a privileged student trying to undermine me." The class gasped. Some students exchanged wide-eyed looks. Others stared in disbelief. Even Dean Callahan looked uneasy. Professor Hayes had just made a fatal mistake. For months she had spoken about fairness, about challenging privilege with merit, and now, faced with a student who had just done exactly that, she had crumbled. Not because of Barron's wealth, but because of his ability. A sharp silence filled the hall. Then Barron moved. Calmly, without hesitation, he bent down, picked up the marker she had thrown aside, and turned back to the board. "Then let's focus on what matters." And in the span of 5 minutes, with nothing but a steady hand and a razor-sharp mind, he solved the problem 2 different ways: the standard approach and the more elegant method based on Leibniz's original work. The room erupted. Spontaneous applause broke out, rolling through the hall like a wave. Students clapped, some even whistling. Even those who had stayed neutral until now couldn't help but acknowledge what they had just witnessed. Even Dean Callahan, despite himself, looked impressed, because, in the end, the lesson had been clearer than ever. Merit won. The incident in Professor Hayes's advanced calculus class spread across campus like wildfire. Videos of the moment flooded social media, shared not just among students but by faculty, alumni, and even scholars outside the university. But instead of fueling the usual debates and division, something unexpected happened. Attendance in advanced calculus tripled. Students who had once dismissed the course as too theoretical were suddenly eager to enroll. Not because of politics, not because of drama, but because they had seen firsthand what true learning looked like. And at the center of it all were 2 people who had changed in very different ways. Professor Hayes, shaken but not broken, found herself at a crossroads. The experience had exposed a flaw in her approach, not her love for education, but the way she had let ideology cloud her purpose. So instead of doubling down, she did something rare in the world of academia. She listened. She returned to what had made her great in the first place, her passion for mathematics. Her lectures, once filled with social narratives, became focused, dynamic, and engaging. She challenged students, not with personal opinions, but with equations, theories, and the beauty of pure mathematics. And Barron? True to his word, he made good on his offer. Every afternoon, after lectures ended, he would stay behind, hosting study sessions for students struggling to keep up with the course. His sessions weren't about showing off. They were about bridging the gap between theory and practice. He explained complex equations in a way that made them click, turning even the most difficult problems into something students could approach with confidence. What started as a small group soon grew into a packed classroom. Students, some of whom had once dismissed Barron as just the famous kid in the back row, now sought his guidance. Even those who had once resented him found themselves respecting him. And then, one afternoon, something even more unexpected happened. Barron was at the whiteboard, walking a struggling student through a difficult problem. When Professor Hayes approached him, for a moment she stood quietly, watching as he patiently explained the equation. There was no arrogance in his voice, no condescension, just the clear, methodical way in which he made sense of something others found impossible. She took a deep breath. Then softly she spoke. "You could have humiliated me that day." Barron paused, turning to face her. She hesitated, then continued. "Instead, you helped me see what truly matters." The room fell silent. A few students nearby looked up, curious. Barron studied her for a moment, then offered a small, knowing smile. "The goal was never to tear anyone down," he said simply. "It was to lift everyone up." Professor Hayes nodded slowly. For the first time in a long time, she saw her students not as pawns in a grand ideological battle, but as young minds hungry for knowledge. Barron picked up the marker again, turning back to the problem. "You're welcome to join us, Professor." A small chuckle escaped her lips. "Maybe I will." And so the calculus class became legendary, not because of politics, not because of conflict, but because of what education is truly meant to be. And Barron, he still sat in the back of the class, still helped struggling students, and that, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all. What a powerful story. This wasn't just about a classroom. It was about standing up for what's right, about the value of knowledge over ego. Barron Trump showed us that true leadership isn't about winning arguments. It's about lifting others up. And isn't that something we can all learn from? In a world that sometimes feels divided, stories like this remind us of the importance of respect, integrity, and education. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think? Should education focus on merit over politics? Let's talk in the comments. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.